Everyone, and welcome to Breakfast for Champions. My name is Tracy Lamb. I'm the Director of Programs and Communications at Partners in Diversity. Thank you so much for being here this bright and early to have this important discussion on race and disability and what employers can do to support people of color with disability. First, a few housekeeping items. For logistical reasons, we have disengaged the chat box. However, the Q&A box is available for you to ask questions of our speakers, which we will have time at the very end, and you can post your questions at any time. This session is being recorded and will be sent to attendees after the event. And today's event is being live captioned by LNS Captioning. To activate that feature, hover over the bottom of the screen and you'll see the menu bar pop up, and you'll see the CC icon as well. Click on it and you'll be able to access the various options that are available. And a couple quick programming notes. For those of you who use our online jobs board, we are excited to announce that we will be upgrading the jobs board next month to provide you with more functionality and flexibility, not to mention an enhanced user experience. So we'll send more information to your member liaisons in the coming weeks. And also, our CEO Diversity Forum takes place December 16th. We host it every 2 years exclusively for leaders in the C-suite roles, executives, and board chairs. An invitation will go out shortly, and we hope you will encourage your executives to attend. Now, I would like to introduce to you our Executive Director, Mari Watanabe. Mari?
Hey, thanks, Tracy. Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you. And again, welcome to Partners in Diversity's Breakfast for Champions. The purpose of Breakfast for Champions is to share impactful approaches to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. I hope this morning's session will inspire you to make meaningful changes within your organization. Programs like this are possible because of members like you, and I'm grateful to our sponsor this morning, Tillamook County Creamery Association. Joining us this morning from Tillamook is Felicia Rivers, Director of Talent. Felicia?
Good morning, everyone. And the first thing I'd like to do is say welcome. I am in agreement with Mari. Welcome. I'm Felicia Rivers, as she mentioned, Director of Talent at Tillamook County Creamery Association, where I oversee our talent strategy to hire, retain, and develop top talent. I'd like to also recognize the fact that this is not only the 30th anniversary of Americans with Disabilities Act, it's also National Disability Employment Awareness Month. At Tillamook, inclusion is a pillar of our shared values. As such, we are proud and honored to sponsor today's Breakfast for Champions. We are on an intentional journey at Tillamook to make progress in our workplace around inclusion and diversity, and are here to learn from this session along with all of you. Today's discussion, as Mari mentioned, will focus on the intersection of race and disability and how employers can help people of color with disabilities. People with disabilities can and do make important contributions to America's workplaces and economies. At work, it is what people can do that matters. We hope today's session will encourage us all to continue to make our workplaces more inclusive. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to the session and give it back to Mari.
Great, thanks, Felicia. And again, thank you to Tillamook County Creamery Association. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge one of our longtime partners, Relay Resources, for helping us put this program together. So again, our topic today is about the intersection of race and disability. It is very poignant because October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month, and this year also marks the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, as Felicia mentioned. It was a landmark law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in employment. So, we like to do our little pop quizzes. So I have a couple questions for all of you. So get your mouse ready to click. So question 1, how many adults in the United States live with some type of disability? There's 21 million, 44 million, 52 million, and 61 million as your choices. So choose which one you think is right. And question 2 is disability is especially common for which of these groups? So adults age 65 years and older, women, American Indians and Alaska Natives, or all of the above. So you will see the screen pop up with the 2 questions, and I'll give you about 30 seconds to complete the poll. So let's see. Oh, I see them myself. In fact, I will, except I know the answer, so this probably is cheating. So, all right. So Tracy, can you let me know when they're close to done?
Yeah, we have about 80% voted so far.
Okay, so another 5 seconds or so, and then why don't we pop up the results? Okay, why don't we go ahead, Tracy, and pop up the results? Oh, great. So question 1 is 61 million. You guys are really smart. So 45% of you picked 61 million. So these answers are according to the 2020 statistics from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. So 61 million, that accounts for about 1 in 4 adults. So think about that. For every 4 people you know, there's a chance that one person has a disability, and shows that disability affects us all. And the second one, the second question, the answer was all of the above. So 2 in 5 adults age 65 years and older have a disability, 1 in 4 women have a disability, and 3 in 10 American Indians, Alaska Natives have a disability. So let's take a closer look at adults with disability by race and ethnicity. So American Indian, Alaska Native is 33%, Blacks 25%, white 20%, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander 17%, Hispanic 17%, and Asian 10%. This intersection of race and disability, or in other terms, racism and ableism, is what we will explore today. So we have with us this morning 5 amazing advocates for people with disabilities and champions of equity and inclusion. We will begin with our presenter and moderator, Iden Campbell. Iden has been an activist for most of his career, first as an advocate for those with intellectual developmental disabilities, then suicide prevention and mental health activism. In 2011, Iden started speaking out against transgender violence when his intern, Lachey McLean, was murdered in Washington, D.C. Iden knew he could no longer live under the radar as a Black transgender man and not speak out against the violence surrounding Black trans women. With that passion, Iden became a national speaker around social justice. Just a second. Steve Hanamura is president of Hanamura Consulting, a firm he founded in 1986. Steve is widely sought after and brings more than 30 years of experience to the consulting, coaching, training, and speaking profession. He has authored 2 books, In Search of Vision and I Can See Clearly, and has written many journal articles. He was recognized as one of the top 40 diversity pioneers in the July-August 2007 edition of Profiles in Diversity Journal. Among Steve's honors are the ASTD Multicultural Network Trainer of the Year Award and his selection as one of the torchbearers for the 1996 Olympics. And all the way from Philadelphia, I want to welcome Zarifa Roberson. Zarifa is an entrepreneur, motivational speaker, and advocate for the disabilities community. At birth, she was diagnosed with club feet and hands and didn't take her first steps until the age of 4. Today, she seeks to eliminate the stigmas and myths among people with disabilities through performances and presentations. Zarifa has 15 years of working experience in the disability community as a vocational rehabilitation counselor, mobile therapist, and wellness coach. She hopes to become the Oprah of the disability community. We are also pleased to have Jim Sinocchi. He heads the Global Office of Disability Inclusion at JPMorgan Chase. Having sustained a spinal cord injury early in his business career, Jim is keenly aware of the challenges facing both people with disabilities and employers. He represents the firm in forums at the United Nations, in discussions with members of Congress, and in meetings with government officials and nonprofit entities. In 2019, Jim was appointed chair of the 19-member Air Carrier Access Act Advisory Committee. Its members advise the U.S. Department of Transportation on issues relating to the air travel needs of passengers with disabilities. Due to a scheduling conflict, Jim will join us at 9 o'clock today. And finally, I want to introduce Cameron Stewart, Director of Janitorial and Landscaping at Relay Resources. Cameron leads Relay's largest social enterprise, employing more than 400 people, a majority of whom identify with having a disability. He and his teammates have had a particularly challenging year navigating the needs of his customers for cleanliness and sanitation through the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as working to clean locations at the epicenter of Portland's social unrest, including the Justice Center, the Hatfield Federal Courthouse, and City Hall. We're going to begin with a short presentation by Iden to help bring into context the impact the pandemic has had on people of color with disabilities and set the framework for the panel discussion. He'll then moderate the panel discussion. After that, we'll take questions from the audience. So remember, Q&A box, not the chat box. So Iden, I will pass things over to you.
I'm trying to get is my video on? All right.
No, your video's still off.
Okay.
But we can hear you.
Okay. That's good. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to the breakfast this morning. Hopefully you have some coffee and maybe a bagel or a donut so that you can relax and enjoy this panel presentation this morning. So as Maury said, this month is National Disability Employment Awareness Month. And first let me introduce myself. I am Iden Campbell, Program Director at Basic Rights Oregon. And Basic Rights Oregon is basically the statewide LGBT organization. And we are a policy organization, and we are here to ensure that all lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer LGBT Oregonians experience legal and lived equality by building broad and inclusive, politically powerful movement, shifting public opinion, and achieving policy victories. Let's talk a little bit about increasing access and opportunity. 2020, which is the slogan for this year's celebration for National Disability Employment Month, and also for the 30th anniversary of the ADA Act. The U.S. Department of Labor announced this month as increasing access and opportunity, and also this month, along with celebrating the 75th year of the observance of ending, we're also celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. You can see the two amazing posters that were created this year to celebrate both NDEAM and the ADA. So we'll talk about invisible diversity, which has been quite an issue in a lot of employment workplaces, but also in the academic field, in elementary through grades K through 12. The definition that I like to use when I'm talking about invisible disability was created by Jill Jacobson, an attorney. Jill says that diversity traditionally is defined to mean racial, ethnic, and gender diversity. but diversity manifests itself in many other ways. Invisible diversity is the diversity we usually do not see when we meet and interact with others. It can encompass disability, religion, class, age, regionalism, sexual orientation, and other characteristics. Some of the ways that invisible diversity shows up in the workplace for people can be ADHD, dyslexia, and also arthritis. Arthritis can also be a visible disability, especially in its late stages, but most of the time in its very early stages, it's definitely a disability that someone would not notice unless the person tells them that they have arthritis. A lot of times disabilities look like people that have physical disabilities, and a lot of our framework for disabilities are people that have visible physical disabilities, people that use wheelchairs, people that may use crutches to get around, or people that may be visually impaired. But a lot of times the invisible disability is in a person with a body that may look able body to most people. And so we just want to also make sure that people understand that a lot of times when disabilities show up, the only way that the employer or coworkers know that that person actually has a disability is if that person asks for a workplace accommodation. And so they would bring their paperwork just like anyone else that has a visible disability, so that they can get those workplace accommodations. Some of the ways that invisible diversity shows up in the workplace with people that have those disabilities is that they may take more breaks, they may need more time to complete their work, they may need to have more of a flexible schedule, so that they can be more productive. Sometimes people may be more productive in the evening hours because the mornings may be too busy and too loud, with much more activity for a person. So they may ask for later evening work, and also to work in a less distracting place. So instead of maybe working in an open cubicle space, someone might ask for to be able to work in an office with a closed door, or either in maybe a place where normally people would go to like take a break, quiet type areas. So those things show up in different ways for people. And these are some of the things that people might ask for to help them be able to work successfully and much more productive. Also, for people with invisible disabilities, they could be with anyone, and it could be a person that you think is like this person that's completely put together, they're well dressed, they're always well spoken to you, and you might not believe that they have a disability unless they say something. And so one of the ways that employers can help shift the thinking around visible disabilities diversity is that we can create internal social media campaigns that show the faces of people that have invisible disabilities. You can also offer staff training that talks about invisible disabilities and how to be able to support your coworkers in the workplace, and also creating workspaces that have more quiet areas for people to go to be able to work throughout the day, and also maybe even creating a more flexible work environment for people, such as staggered shift work, where people can come in, instead of coming in at 8:30 or 9 o'clock, they can maybe come in at 11 and work until 7. So being able to create a lot of internal support for your employees is important to make the shift in your organization, so that people that have invisible disabilities are more open and forthcoming and not ashamed to share that disability with you. Let's talk about COVID, disabilities, and race. In a 2020 study by the National Disability Institute, They did a nationwide study, and it was basically a course. They talked to people with disabilities across the nation about employment, economic issues, housing, and also educational concerns as well. Some of the findings were that 20% of people with disabilities working in January of 2020 this year were out of work by May of 2020 this year due to COVID. Amongst those BIPOC Americans with disabilities, 35% of those lost their jobs. Of the estimated 3.3 million Black people working age individuals with disabilities, 750,000 of those were employed and at work in January. But by April of 2020, 44% of them were no longer working. Amongst the Latinx community with disabilities, 22% of those workers with disabilities lost their jobs between April and May of this year. These disparities highlight the intersection of disparities that BIPOC people face with disabilities. And losing your job, that leads to other things that make it hard for you to be able to maintain yourself. Losing your job leads to, maybe losing your housing, maybe losing your insurance, which affects the way people are able to stay safe from not getting COVID. So definitely employment plays a huge part in people with disabilities being able to maintain their safety from becoming ill and also losing their housing, which also stands a very serious risk of catching COVID. And we'll put the link to this study in the chat box. It's a really good study, and it was basically a statewide study, countrywide study. Also, amongst BIPOC Americans with disabilities, they face unique systemic challenges as a result of their intersecting identities. Earlier this summer, a Black man named Michael Hickson with quadriplegia died of COVID-19. His doctors decided to terminate his treatment because they thought that even if he survived, his quality of life would not be high. And this was based on the fact that he simply had a disability. And so he was allowed to, basically die because he had a disability. And from their viewpoint, a person with a disability would not have a high quality of life if they survive COVID. COVID has left a lot of disabled BIPOC people with that are vulnerable with decreased access to resources that they already had a hard time accessing. And one of the things we want to ensure for people with disabilities is that they're not being denied services just because they have a disability when they show up to be tested for COVID, and also when they're
Iden, you froze. You're frozen. We can't hear you.
Maury, can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Yay.
Okay. All right. I was praying not to have any issues. I need to pray harder. Okay, next slide, Tracy, please.
Iden, we can't
Can
hear
you hear
you.
me?
Oh, yeah. Why don't you turn your camera off? And I think that might just help. And then just, yeah.
Okay, how about now?
Yes, that's good.
Okay, all right. Next slide, Tracy, please. Okay, so in reference to the death that I just talked about, Michael's death hasn't been the only death that has happened in the disability community that has worried people with disabilities, but also disability advocates. Across the country, advocates have been filing complaints against states that have these vague policies, in particular 4 states who policies stated that people with disabilities would not be put on ventilators if they needed it. Unfortunately, Oregon and Washington State are two of those states who have very vague policies. And we'll also put that in the chat box so that you can see those policies that they have. But basically, Oregon's policy says underlying medical conditions and their impact on long-term prognosis. We expect to release, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to put that in there. But basically, Oregon's policy states that if a person does have underlying comorbidities, that they will not be the first in line to receive ventilators. And so disability advocates are definitely fighting to have that change. And this was a policy that was last updated in 2018. I searched, but I did not find an update for 2020. So if anybody has an update, let us know about that. And also in Washington State, which was actually updated this year, they have a vague approach to the policy as well, which basically states that people with underlying comorbidities will also be considered to be the last people to get ventilators if they need them. And so this is something that advocates, self-advocates and advocates are definitely fighting for, to have these things change, in particular 21 states that are advocating for these type of policies to be put in place, is that people with disabilities deserve to be treated with medically sound practices, just as any other person that comes to the hospital that is being affected by the COVID disease. Next slide, Tracy. So despite this being the 30th anniversary of the ADA, 61 million Americans with disabilities are still facing persistent disparities in employment, income production, and net worth between people with and without disabilities. These disparities remain even larger for BIPOC Americans with disabilities. So today we'll talk with our panel members, and we'll discuss the diversities that people with disabilities are facing, some of the ways that we as co-workers and employers can help these people move forward in the work life, but also in community life as well. And we hope that you participate in that by going on social media and using our hashtags for the 75th anniversary of NDEAM, hashtag NDEAM, and also for the ADA, hashtag thanks to the ADA, and hashtag ADA30. And you'll also see our Twitter handles at Diversity PDX, at Partners in Diversity on IG, Twitter at Relay Resources, and also on IG at Relay Resources, and for Basic Rights Oregon at Basic Rights on Twitter, at Basic Rights Oregon on IG, and you can tweet at Zarifa Roberson on Twitter, and on IG at Zarifa_Roberson on IG, and me on Twitter and IG at Iden Campbell. And we'll also throw those in the chat box as well. Thank you. Okay, Mari,
Yes,
can you still hear me?
yes. You're good.
Okay, all right.
And Jim Sinocchi has joined us. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Jim, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself, Jim?
Yep, I'm here. Thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. If you like
Um,
to, you can introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm Jim Sinocchi. I am head of disability inclusion at JPMorgan Chase, and I've been with the firm for 4+ years now.
Okay, welcome.
Thank you.
Right. And so Jim actually started off the introductions. I got a little ahead of myself, but let's start the introductions off with Steve now, and then we'll go to Zarifa and to Cameron.
Steve Hanamura, Hanamura Consulting. I think Mari already pretty well captured what we do. I am a blind Japanese male. And in addition to the work we do, I preceded my consulting career as a community college counselor, a government worker, and a corporate person because I felt I couldn't get into the real world unless I worked in those arenas first and had something to prove that we could be competent.
Thanks, Jim. Zarifa?
Hi everyone, how are you doing? My name is Zarifa Roberson. I work for the state of Maryland, the District of Columbia, and New Jersey as a VR counselor or specialist. So I help people with disabilities become employed or sustain employment in my position. I no longer work for those agencies. I'm an entrepreneur with a disability. My platform is on sexuality versus disability. I'm trying to increase, bring awareness among sexuality in the disability community.
Okay, Cameron?
Yeah, thanks, Iden. Good morning, everyone. I think Tracy did do a great job giving us all a little bit of an introduction, but I do work with Relay Resources, which is a local Portland nonprofit that provides training, employment, and affordable housing solutions to disabled folks in our community. Relay's been around since 1951, originally started as a school for disabled children at a time in this country when there were not resources available. So a group of families got together in Portland to make sure that their children had access to education. And as their children grew older, they looked for employment opportunities and leveraged some federal and state legislation and procurement law that made it possible for nonprofits like Relay Resources to gain access to service work for public agencies. So, at this point, we have multiple social enterprises, including janitorial, landscaping, document services, and supply chain solutions that provide meaningful work to our staff and quality services to customers throughout Portland. I've been with Relay for 7 years, most recently leading the janitorial division, which is Relay's largest social enterprise, employing close to 500 folks. Most of whom identify as having a disability. In janitorial, we're responsible for cleaning 10 million square feet a night throughout Portland. We clean the Portland Airport, Portland State University, and a number of other county, state, and federal sites. I think that's it. Excited to be here.
All right, thanks, Cameron. You guys are busy over there. Yeah. Okay, so let's start the panel off with the first question to you, Zarifa. As a Black woman with a disability, how often do you feel like you may have been turned down for positions due to either being a Black woman or having a visible disability? Also, how has this played out for you in the business world?
Oh, that's a great question. It had me going back to my days when I lived in Maryland. For those who don't know, I live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm a Philly girl, so I'm an East Coast girl. But when I was going out for interviews when I first moved to Maryland, I was working on my master's degree at Coppin State University and I needed a job. So one of the places that I interviewed for, I did a very good interview, but on the way out, I fell in front of the person that interviewed me. And another person asked me if I was okay, and I was okay. But I think that led to them not hiring me based on that fall. And having a physical disability, when you have mobility impairments, or when your balance is not really great, it comes with my disability. And I felt like when they saw that, they didn't hire me. And I was like, kind of like kind of like, darn it, why did I fall in front of them? But it happens, and I look at it like it can happen to anyone. Everyone falls, and people with disabilities fall a little bit more than the average person. So I looked at that as a way of them not hiring me, but then everything happens for a reason. Then I end up getting hired with the state of Maryland. So that was one of my trying moments. But it didn't break me. It just like, they hired me because of not hiring me because of that fall. I wasn't a person for them anyway, because they should have got to know me and looked at my work practice and really looked at my strengths that was actually on my resume.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, any input on the business world? Because I know that you've had your own magazine and you're definitely an entrepreneur.
Yes, I get kind of side eyes in the business world, like, who is this person? And when I start speaking, they're like, oh, okay. And I'm only 4'9½", so I do get a little side eye because they don't know what to expect because they see the physical disability. They don't know how intellectually stimulating I am, because when they see the physical disability, they assume at times that you have something intellectually wrong with you. And so when I go and present, or when I make that contact, or when I show up to a business, they're meeting with them, sometimes they're a little bit off-putting. But then when I tell them I'm very open about my disability, I was born with arthrogryposis multiplex congenia. Try saying that one time. But I tell people that I just say I have AMC, like the movie theater. That's the acronyms for my disability. And a lot of people are, if they heard of my disability, they're very shocked because I'm very independent. I live independently. So when they see me, like, oh, you have AMC, wow, you're very independent. And it kind of lightens up the mood, because I think some people don't know how to take it because they don't know how to, like, it's kind of like a little off-putting, but I love it. I love having a disability. I have no other choice in life to love my disability, because I never lived without having a disability. So this is the only life I live. But I think in the business world, it kind of gets like, oh, okay, who's this little girl? Who's this young lady? What is she talking about? So I get a little side-eye, but once I start speaking, they kind of like warm up to me. Thanks, Iden, for the great question.
All right. Steve, the next question for you. As a blind man of color, I'm curious about how you learned the concept of being Asian, since race in the U.S. has so much to do with color, the color of your skin, and you don't see color.
Well, the truth is, it's not a concept, it's an experience. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941, and it set this nation in a turmoil about Japanese people. So very early, I experienced discrimination. My parents had to leave, and they were put in a concentration camp. And so it was not a concept. It was a real live experience. There was nothing thought to be walking down the street and somebody would say, hey, Jap. I mean, more than even the N-word, it was just called out in the supermarket. So very early. The other part of that is being blind in Japanese, was not able to go to a regular school. I was born in 1944, so there was no such thing as ADA, or even the Civil Rights Act of 1964 wasn't even passed yet. So the concept of Asian is experience, not being told you can't do something, being made fun of. But both my brother and I were able to become student body officers. We were leaders in school, and that was part of the bridge builder, the bridge the gap between being Asian and being a regular person.
Thank you for that, Steve. And we'll talk a little bit more about that generational experience later in the conversation. Cameron, as an employer whose mission is to hire people with disabilities and other barriers to employment, how does race intersect with hiring a person with a disability? Do people of color with disabilities have a harder time than one who has the same disability, but not a person of color?
Thanks, Iden. I think that's a great question. I think it's first important for me to acknowledge that I can't speak about the intersectionality of race and disability based on my own lived experience. So I'm here today as an ally for the disabled and BIPOC communities. And I need to further acknowledge that my privilege and my lived experience as a straight, white, cisgender man in America has allowed me the opportunity to speak from an executive leadership role in solidarity with the BIPOC and disabled communities at Relay. My journey with equity, diversity, and inclusion has really just begun. And I still have a lot to learn. This is uncomfortable today for me. I'm nervous. I'm afraid to say the wrong thing or to show my unconscious biases, or really to be vulnerable in front of such a large group. However, it's because of this privilege that I feel it's my duty and my obligation to use this platform to speak for those whose voices are suppressed and silenced by the systemic racism, ableism, and oppression built into the DNA of American society. Regarding your question, Iden, I read the article from National Disability Institute as well, and it was really fascinating, all the data points they had. And I think one thing that really stood out to me from that article was the statement that the most financially vulnerable population in America is the group of individuals that live at the intersection of disability, race, and ethnicity. And you referenced some of the data points around job loss through the early months of the pandemic in 2020. And you can see similar data points and trends continue when you look at disparity and inequality across education levels or poverty lines or housing costs and net worth. At Relay, we have a really diverse workforce. Amongst 700 employees, there's 27 languages spoken. And of course, we're still a reflection of the community in Portland, which lacks diversity compared to some other communities. We surveyed some employees about the intersectionality of disability and BIPOC, and we found that 72% identified as having a disability and only 22% identified as BIPOC individuals. And so it gives you a little snapshot of what our world looks like with this intersectionality. I think one way to really think about how this affects employment and can make it more difficult for folks that find themselves, within this community is the first day on the job. I think we all know that the first day on any job is very difficult, right? You want to be in the right place at the right time. You want to make sure you know what you're doing. It's unnerving and it's challenging. And I think when you start to consider sort of the layering effect of being disabled, maybe you have an invisible disability, you're struggling with mental health, and then you're also perhaps a member of the Latinx community and you're not very proficient in English. So you're coming in on that first day and you immediately have a language barrier. You maybe have a cultural barrier. You're looking around at your colleagues and your supervisor and they don't look like you, they don't sound like you, their culture's not like yours. And you also have a disability that requires accommodations that you're not comfortable sharing. You can really kind of see how that combination makes a difficult situation so much more difficult. So I think that's a good example of just how challenging that can be for folks.
Thanks, Cameron. One of the things that really struck me about the NDI study was that as a person with an invisible disability, and I didn't take a part in that survey at all, but the numbers match my life to a T. And I think it's important for us to recognize the way intersectionality plays a part in people's lives that have disabilities, whether they're visible or not. and how can we bring an intersectional lens to the disability world. So that's something I definitely hope that Relay would look into more in the future. So thanks, Cameron, for that answer. Jim, I would like your perspective on this as someone who works within a large organization. Employment rates among working age adults with disabilities are persistently low. A 2011 study funded by NDI, NID on rehabilitation research showed that the top reasons employers don't hire people with disabilities is 1, the cost of providing reasonable accommodations, 2, that they don't know how to handle the needs, and 3, that they're afraid they won't be able to discipline or fire a worker with a disability for poor performance because of potential lawsuits. What are your responses to these statements? Perhaps dispel some of these concerns.
Jim, you are on mute.
Got it.
Yeah, thanks.
I think those are reasonable assumptions for people. I don't think, though, that they're a barrier in any way to the qualifications of a person that joins an organization who has the skills to do so. So at JPMorgan Chase, over the last 4 years since I've been here, we've hired over 4,000 people with disabilities into the firm. And they kind of match the 10,000 plus people that have identified with disabilities. And we probably have a large contingent in our 250,000 person population that don't identify. However, you know, there is a price of entry when you talk about the ADA and how do you have to, if you want talented people that may have a disability, you have to find ways to bridge that. So that's why accommodations are so important. Over the last 4 years, we've provided 20,000 accommodations to our employees around the world. A big portion of that had to do with ergonomic furniture, but a smaller portion, about 5,000 or 6,000, had to do with technology changes, real estate changes, putting in ramps, automatic doors. And so with our population around the world, the bank is in a process of modifying buildings so people with disabilities of whatever issue or disability they have can partake in the firm truly. I think that in my job there, what I'm trying to do is sort of, my job is to make the able-bodied population, including executives, feel comfortable with a person with a disability. Because as you know, they bring their unconscious bias, or, you know, when I do talks, I usually tell audiences, you worry about 2 things. You don't know if you're going to catch something from us, some kind of disease, or you're going to be politically incorrect. And that's what makes people tentative about this community. And so as a person with a disability, we have a responsibility to understand that and engage the able-bodied population in a way where they get to learn about us, understand our skills, understand our preferences, and become part of a community. And I think we've done that pretty well at the bank.
Okay, thank you, Jim. I wanted to ask you one more question in relation to reasonable accommodations. A lot of people think that if they hire a person with a disability, that they're on the front end, they're going to spend thousands of dollars trying to make the workplace accommodating to that person. Can you kind of dispel that myth as well, that there isn't always an upfront cost of thousands of dollars to make that happen?
No, that's true. I mean, you know, we provide, for example, laptops for people with either deaf or hard of hearing or blind or mobility impaired people to connect to our system. Because as you know, a lot of corporations are going to the virtual display stations where, you know, you don't need a laptop, everything works through the system. But we make thousands of dollars of investments in people with disabilities to give them the tools they need. So there are some, you know, some of those products cost money, but in terms of, we're hiring some of the very best people, and it, you know, cost to get them working and becoming productive for our clients doesn't matter. But there is a cost, but I think it's marginal compared to the other side. For example, if you're a federal contractor and you have contracts with the federal government, you have to abide by the 7% goal of hiring people with disabilities, plus doing the right thing when it comes to promoting people, training people, and giving them full-blown careers. There's a cost to everything, but it's not as daunting as you think. I mean, the standard number people say is that most accommodations cost under $500.
Thanks a lot for that. Thank you, Jim.
Sure.
Okay, let's talk about conscious and unconscious bias in the workplace. Cameron mentioned that, and you also mentioned that as well, Jim, in your comments. Zarifa, in terms of bias, both conscious and unconscious, what are some of the biases you've experienced in the workplace as a woman of color with a disability?
I had people assume that I wasn't intelligent enough or I couldn't speak for myself. Not the people that hired me, but other coworkers. I had comments about my hair on the job. Today you see crochets. Back in the day, around 2010 or 11, this wasn't really popular. I had, sometimes I had problems with fixing my hair to come to work, and some of my coworkers nasty comments about my hair, and I'm just like, okay, you don't understand my limitations. You don't know my functional limitations about this is part of my limitation as a Black woman with a disability. Instead of them trying to help me, they just kind of embarrassed me and made me feel belittled. But when it came to my work, I never felt unbiased because the proof was always in the pudding. You gave me something to do, I'll do it, and my work speaks for itself. But it was more of the unbiasedness coming from coworkers, and I'm just like, wow, these are the people that are actually working with the disability population, the people that I'm actually amongst this population. These are the people that are actually working with my population. Y'all have a lot of unbiases. So sometimes the people that some of the agencies hire, even though it's a disability related organization, they may not really truly, they hire some able-bodied people. I don't know, some of my coworkers have invisible disabilities. I knew some of them did, but the ones that made the nasty comments, they felt as though that they had an invisible disability. To me. But I actually had a biased comment from one of the clients that I was actually helping to get unemployment for. We talked on the phone and we was great. We had great conversation. But when he saw me and this consumer had a mental health disability, she's like, oh my gosh, she's handicapped. And I'm like, oh, I didn't hear it, but the receptionist said that to me. And I'm just like, wow, what does it matter? As long as I'm doing my job, what does it matter if I have a physical disability as well? So there are some biases in the workplace. But I kind of like prove people wrong once I start doing my work to actually eliminate those biases in the workplace.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Cameron, how can workplaces better educate their employees, especially hiring managers, on bias towards people with disabilities?
Thanks, Iden. Great question. I think it really starts with company culture, first and foremost, and specifically words matter. At Relay, we have 8 commitments. You can see them in my background here. You probably can't read them, which I understand, but front and center, we respect our differences. That's a commitment that we all make to one another within this organization. Other commitments include we presume positive intent, we expect honesty and integrity, we hold each other accountable. And so, I think that one of the ways workplaces really can become more inclusive is starting with a culture that's inclusive. And at Relay, we call that a culture of love. Obviously training, so bias training for hiring having standardized interview processes and a guide that sort of helps managers engage without bias and understand what bias is, particularly ableism, and other trainings like mental health first aid, I think are really valuable. One of the big things employers need to do is increase accessibility to everyone. That starts with the application process. So make that as simple as possible, have multiple options available. So, applying online, applying over the phone with somebody directly helping you fill out an application, coming in and filling out a paper application. Of course, some of that's a little more difficult in the world right now with social distancing, but those types of things. And then really reducing the barrier to entry and to apply. So I think things like offering translations and interpretation to anybody who's incoming, so that folks who speak different languages, aren't comfortable with English, have an immediate way to ask questions and conduct an interview. I don't require a resume or a cover letter if you don't have to. That's difficult for a lot of folks. Or if that's needed, provide services to help people generate those. I think you can eliminate a lot of other non-necessary pre-employment requirements. For example, Relay eliminated phone screening from our pre-employment process for a lot of the positions we're hiring, because a phone screen can be challenging for a lot of folks if you're not comfortable on the phone. Again, the high anxiety, things like that, a language barrier, and I think that is a barrier for folks coming in. Eliminating drug screening, actually, if possible, is a great way to open up opportunities, not necessarily because you want to hire people that may have a drug problem. It's mostly about drug testing provokes anxiety in folks. People with disabilities take prescription medication that can flag a drug test and cause an awkward situation. Or you have situations where cannabis is legal in the state like it is in Oregon, and it's not legal federally, and there's a gray area there within employment law. So, things like that are really, really valuable. One of the things Relay does is an open orientation. And when I say does, I would say up through February 29th or so. This year we did this, and then it was a quick shift. So open orientation, right? So day one, everybody who's hired and is coming in that week comes to Welcome to Relay and sits in the same room. So that can be the CEO and a janitor and everybody else within the company. And day one, we're talking about these concepts, we're talking about these commitments, we're learning about mental health, how we treat each other. Then I think that really just goes back to that culture. Lastly, it's really about meeting people where they're at and focusing on the individual, not the disability. I think that people get caught up in what someone can't do versus focusing on what they can do. And there's this concept that we talk about, which is the also function. And that might be like, well, there's the core responsibilities of a job, but we'd also like you to be able to do some other tasks. An example might be for an accountant. Yeah, well, we'd like you to be able to move these file boxes once a week. And that's difficult for somebody with a physical disability. So really letting go of that also function, or those, I guess, what I kind of call the other duties as assigned.
Thanks, Cameron. Those were some really great examples of being able to, change the workspace and to, take away some of those other duties as assigned and not even have to spend a dime doing those things. So thank you for those great examples. Steve, we know there's a bias against people of color. We know there's bias against people with disability. The intersection of race and disability, however, is not often talked about. What's the impact bias against people of color with disability?
One of the impacts is you don't know which dimension of your diversity is discriminated against. Not because of my disability or because of my race. This was especially true in dating relationships. I never knew if it was because of blindness or because of my ethnicity, why the parents of the women I wanted to go out with, or the young women, or the parents, or the women themselves, was it because I'm blind, and was it because I'm a person of color? However, there was one other thing that was added for me. Someone said there's a third reason why you're not acceptable. That's because you're a jerk. So one of the things we have to remember is we are human beings also, and we have to be forthright, we have to be truthful, but there is truthfully a time when you never know. I think the best strategy is to find some good friends or colleagues and get some feedback. They may be able to give me input into which dimension am I overzealous, am I extra hostile, maybe you're too sensitive, but people that I trust who know who I am, or who the person of color is, or the person's disability. We need allies, and I think it was you, Cameron, that spoke about being an ally. Then we need that kind of allyship and perspective.
Aside from what's legally required, what standards and processes can organizations implement to truly support employees with disabilities, particularly people of color with disabilities?
You blanked out. Were you referring to me? I think you were. This is Jim.
Oh yeah, Jim, that question was for you.
Okay.
Would you like me to reread it?
Yeah, please. Yeah, I think I could read the question, but I'd rather you say it again.
Okay. All right. Aside from what's legally required, what standards and processes can organizations implement to truly support employees with disabilities, particularly people of color with disabilities?
Well, one of the two things on that. Number one, I found that the intersectionality with disability and race is not, how should I say, thought of a lot when it comes to people with disabilities. When I recruit people with disabilities for the firm, I go after everybody. If you have a disability and you're Black and you're qualified, I'll hire you. If you're qualified as a woman, I'll hire you. And it goes that way. But some of my diversity colleagues, not only in my business, but when I worked at IBM and other places, they have a goal to hire just women and able-bodied people across the spectrum, Asian, Black, Hispanic. I often use the term that the disability community is considered the runt of the litter. And for those of you that are familiar with that term, it's the smallest dog in a litter of other dogs. They call us the runt. And, I've adopted that for myself, but this little runt, has a lot of energy, and I'm trying to change that paradigm. So part of my job at the bank is to get my colleagues who are brilliant in the diversity segments that they manage to think about hiring people with disabilities. And you guys can look it up, but in every community, whether you're gay, Black, Hispanic, etc., there's a group of people that are disabled. And most of our BRG communities don't look at the disabled population within their group. So that's something that we try to create more awareness about, because we're not going to get very far in terms of universal diversity if we don't look for people within the group that you may not even acknowledge. Because as you know, the able-bodied population shuns away from disability issues and people as well. So there's a learning curve there, and this intersectionality in this new era of diversity is very important. The second thing that I want to talk about is when I joined the bank 4.5 years ago, the first thing I did was write a policy letter for the chairman to sign and a standard for the firm. And the reason why I started doing that first, as I introduced myself to the community, was to put in place policies and standards that managers can abide by. But not only abide by, but we gave managers air cover to hire people with disabilities. Because what managers get worried about, because they're tagged with their results and financial gains or whatever piece of the business you're in, you have goals. And you don't want to hire people that you think are weak or can't do the job. But with the standard, it gave the firm air cover for the managers to say, look, we're behind you. You have the go to go do this. You're going to get the help. you have the accommodations, you have the training, and we're there for you. So when you do this, in my view, and in my 65 years on this planet, you've got to teach people how to behave when it comes to changes that are different. And I think we did a pretty good job doing that at the bank. As an example, last year, in the materials that we produce for the firm, we have 270,000 people at the bank. Last year, we had 300,000 readers for the materials, the stories that we talked about, our people in the company who had disabilities. This included mobility impaired, blind, deaf, even mental illness. And having 300,000 people, I know they're not all disabled, but this touched a nerve with people who felt better about reading about this. They probably had parents or children that had disabilities. They may have faced issues themselves. So it was like a coming out in the last 4 years with people who are comfortable to talk about this. And when we do events around this topic at the bank, we get huge crowds. You know, we get the able-bodied and the disabled in these things. So we think, at least I think, we're making a change, not fast enough for me, but I think we're getting there. And that's important to note in terms of when you do this work, you've got to bring people on board, and we tout them as champions. I give out a champion award every year to executives and people with disabilities that have earned it, just to recognize them for what they've done and how they've done it. And we've also had, you know, we have the BRG events, we have that, and we have over 10,000 people in our BRGs around the world that are all part of this. And so there's a lot of wholesomeness when you look at this, if you present it the right way. A lot of times, able-bodied people get nervous when you thrust it in their faces, but there's got to be a way where you could reach out, explain to them what's going on, and that they don't have to be afraid of us or afraid of hiring us.
Thank you, Jim. I have one more question for you, Jim. Recently, I've read a comment from the CEO of Wells Fargo, who said that it's hard to find Black talent, and so that's why they don't have a lot of Black people working at Wells Fargo. Have you heard that as far as people with disabilities? Has anyone ever said to you that it's hard to find a person that has a disability with talent to work at JPMorgan?
Well, shoot, I hired 4,000 people since I got there. It's not that hard, because, you know, we have if you have the will to get this done, and look, the bank called me, and you ought to hear this story. When I retired from IBM about 5 years ago in 2016, I was I was in my retirement, putting up my feet, sitting by my fireplace with a blanket over my lap, you know, to get warm. And I get a call that said the bank is looking for people to take on this disability role at the bank. And I turned it down when the recruiters called me. I said, look, I just retired. I don't want to go back. And my friend, Deb Daggett, who many of you may know in the business, talked to me, said, Jim, just talk to them, see what you can do. And I did talk to them. And as I was interviewing with them, I put together a deck that gave them the strategy that I started at IBM, but I added more things based on what I learned at IBM that I put into for the bank. And when I talked to Pat David, who interviewed me, I said, Pat, here's my deck. Here's what I want to do. And I said, I will come and do this job for you if you let me use my strategy, because I know what will work based on the history of what I used to do at IBM. I was a marketing communications executive, and I did disability as a hobby. So she looked at me and said, okay, you're going to be hired, and we'll do it the way you want to do it. The point was, when I asked them why they wanted to do this, they said, we've been able to get it done for the other groups, but we don't know how to get it done for disability inclusion. And I knew that, number one, that was an honest answer. And number two, if I worked for a bank like JPMorgan with their brand, I could probably get some notoriety, not for the bank, but for a community of people with disabilities that will end up working here to prove that this can be done. So nothing is a given in terms of life and the jobs you go to and the things you need to do. But, you know, some people take a chance on you. I took a chance on them, and it worked out. I'm still here, and we're still pushing away. So there's a lot that goes into this, and I don't think whether you're Black, Hispanic, or anybody that's an issue. But you got to be deliberate. The bank was deliberate on hiring people with disabilities. And if you guys saw our announcement this week, where our bank came out to help low-income people, to help people of color to get jobs, it's a deliberate act, and it takes work. This is not an assimilation play. Oh, they'll come. You've got to show people that you're wanted, and we want you for your skills.
Awesome, Jim. I want to give you all the hearts today, all the way through February, Valentine's Day, all the hearts.
Oh, thank you. I could use a heart. I could use a couple. Yeah.
All right, Cameron. So we're talking about visible diversity now. Many of Relay Resources employees identify as having an invisible disability. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and the stigma associated with it?
Yeah, definitely. When you look across Relay and our disabled population, it breaks down pretty cleanly into thirds. So 1/3 of our team identify as having a physical disability, 1/3 is intellectual or developmental, and 1/3 is mental health. Really, all of these can be invisible. I think that we tend to think of physical disabilities as being more visible, but a good example is somebody who's hearing impaired, but very good at reading lips, can get by day to day with people not really knowing that they don't hear well. And now comes COVID and everybody puts a mask on, and now this person can no longer communicate well in the workplace. So just kind of a recent example of the times. I think the stigma and invisible disability is really around mental health. So it's that shame or disgrace people feel, that fear, that makes them feel excluded and ultimately leads them to suppress, that disability and not share it, not ask for help. I think a lot of people struggle with mental health and don't disclose it out of fear. And that may be because of past work experience or trauma that they've experienced in their life, or a cultural stigma that exists within their community or within their family. But that disability is with that person all day, every single day, all the time. And no one else can see it and they don't disclose it. So there's a perception, that these folks can appear higher functioning, and people may commit to doing more than they are actually capable of doing, which becomes very challenging for these individuals over time. I think there's a real connection to the intersectionality of race and mental health, again, as an invisible disability. The stigma is greater within the BIPOC community. Cultural differences impact that stigma. So for people growing up with an invisible disability, they don't necessarily have family support. It's harder to discuss, to gain acceptance, to open up to others. And so over time, that stays with them. When they get to a workplace, they're certainly not going to talk about it with their employer for fear of reprisal. Statistically speaking, it's harder for BIPOC individuals to get mental health treatment in the US. Doctors here tend to lack cultural competence. And that's cultural competence is the ability to recognize the different places their patients are coming from and be able to adapt to their needs. So for example, if you've grown up in a community or a culture where you can't talk about having a mental health disability or what you might be struggling with that's invisible, you're not going to come right out to your doctor and say, I'm depressed. You may say it in another way, like I'm fatigued or I'm tired. And doctors don't necessarily know to understand that whatever that person's cultural background may be, they may be expressing how they're feeling in a different way. And so I think that is a real barrier for folks. Obviously, language barrier plays into this as well. If you're looking to find a therapist or somebody to talk to, you might have a hard time finding somebody that speaks your language. The thing about trying to encourage your employees to ask for accommodations and disclose their invisible disabilities, particularly around mental health, is an ongoing challenge. I think, Relay is completely dedicated to supporting individuals with disabilities. I mean, our existence as a company and an organization is built around the foundation of providing opportunities, training, support, employment for folks that have disabilities. We talk about it from day one. We have requirements with the federal and state governments to share data on the folks that work for us. If you look within janitorial, our workers are represented by SEIU, a union, right? And within that union CBA, there's seniority rules. Seniority rules in our CBA, because of the type of work we do, protect disabled workers more so than non-disabled. So if there's a layoff, which is something that we went through recently, people that have a disability are protected from being laid off. It's not about tenure, it's about whether you have that. And still, folks do not want to disclose this to us because of the fear that they have around that stigma. So I think it's an ongoing challenge, and it's our job to work to destigmatize it.
Iden, you're on mute.
Okay, we're out of time now for more panel questions, but I'm going to turn it over to Mari, and Mari will answer, will feed us some of the questions that came out of the Q&A chat. So Mari, are you ready?
Yes, thanks, Iden. So here's a couple questions. We have about 10 minutes. So one question is, does anyone have suggestions on how companies can make more employees feel comfortable to ask for any necessary accommodations?
I could help with that.
Thank you, Jim.
Look, when we announced the Office of Disability Inclusion at the bank, so that was a big event. People with disabilities at the bank said, wow, we've got some people here that are going to look after us or help us, and so did the executives. And what we do is, when we announced the accommodations team, it wasn't up right away. It took about 6 months or so for me to get that done, because you had to bring in staff, you had to get budget, things like that. But we announced that. So the idea is that if you have a company that wants to do this, you've got to plan it out like a marketing campaign. And you say, this office here is to do this. Here is the support tools. Here's the training tools. You train your managers, you train your recruiters, and you set up an accommodations team that delivers that. Now, our accommodations team is based in the United States, but we deliver accommodations around the world. And so it's a one-stop shopping place. I'd like to say it's seamless, but we break some dishes too. But we've got people in the Philippines, in England, in APAC, in LATAM, in England, all doing this. I even have a captioning team that is bought and paid for by the bank, where we deliver internal captioning for our deaf employees around the world. So the idea is, if you're going into this model of doing this and doing it right, you set it up, and then you inform people about what's available, how you get it, and get the techies to make sure that your environment's accessible, from software to delivering laptops for people who are blind or deaf to use them. So it gets complicated, but it's sort of seamless once you put all the pieces together. The mistakes a lot of companies make is that they say, we're going to hire these people. And then I say, to do what? And once they get in your business, how do you support them? Because they just don't start like everybody else. And we ask people to tell us if they need an accommodation before you come to work, so we could plan for you. And with tongue in cheek, we've had people ask for hotel rooms when we say an accommodation, right? Are you going to get me a room near the bank for the interview? So we have fun with that stuff, but all in all, you have to approach it holistically, not a piece at a time. Because if you do it a piece at a time, everybody gets frustrated. The employee, the manager, the folks trying to help, real estate, trying to make your buildings accessible. So it really takes a process to get this done, to do it right.
Jim, the other part of that is if I'm from a multicultural area, my culture, I'm not as prone to being willing to ask those questions either.
That's right.
So the one-on-one is helpful, and key people strategically placed will assist me. I'll ask you privately, but I'll never speak up in a meeting.
And many people don't, because it's still private, and people are still, they'll always wonder if they're accepted because they have a disability and people have to, or they're genuinely embraced by the culture. So there's a lot of things that go on, like changing the culture, writing about it, like making them know that we have a policy, that the leadership's behind it. And to Chase's credit, when I was hired, I had to do 16 interviews, as they were vetting me around the world. And when I got to the bank, I was interviewed by the chairman and all his direct reports. And what the reason for that was, they wanted to make sure that I became more and accessible to everybody in leadership, to say, Jim is going to be doing this work. Now you know what he does. Let's help him. And so it has to be orchestrated. It's not spontaneous. So I hope that gives you some insight to how to do this.
Thank you, Jim and Steve. Anybody else like to add to? Okay, the next question is, are there specific hiring platforms that the recruiters can use to hire disabled candidates?
You want me to take that?
Sure.
So, look, you know what? What I tell people who call me or get in touch with me, I say, go to the website. Go to the website, look for a job that you're qualified to do, and apply for it. We will look at every candidate that goes in there, and they get vetted out. What I do also ask that if you qualified for a job and I'm aware of it, I will take a look at your resume and check that out too. But I don't make any hiring decisions. I'm the guy that's sort of like the doorman that says, come into the door, let me show you to your room. But you've got to do all the work. And I assure you that we look for a lot of candidates, and we get about 40,000 or 50,000 applications a year for jobs throughout the bank. That's a lot. But not everybody makes it. But the idea is, our disabled population, our people with disabilities, have to learn to go through the process and make it happen. So, for example, I know for a fact that disabled people send 2 resumes into an employer. One that says they are disabled and one that says they're not. Which one do you think that they get more bites on? The one where they're not, right? But when I talk to managers, I tell them this story, and I say the reason why they don't do it is because they get rejected. But when a person walks in with a disability, I have the 80-20 rule. People who come in with their bio send it because they have 80% of what a manager needs to do a job. All we have to do at the bank or any business is teach them the 20%. And that includes people with disabilities. Because if they're qualified to apply and you look at it and you call them in and shocked because they're blind, why do you get nervous about that? All you have to do is teach them the 20%, and you have a process inside the bank now that helps you do that. So these are the things that we think about to make this happen.
One of the things that's missing from this conversation is teaching people with disabilities how to network. The reason how I got in, because there was none of this, no regulations, no ADA, no nothing. I joined professional organizations, or I joined some organization where somebody knew somebody and they would coach me offline. If it's a lower level job, you still can teach people how to network, to ask people questions about who do you know. It's not what you know, sometimes it's who you know.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Jim. Any of our panelists like to weigh in on this question? Okay, so I have one more, and we only have a couple minutes. So we have a question of how what extent to which in which a disability becomes a part of one's identity, similar to race, culture, gender identity. As a person with an invisible disability, I can work very hard to hide it and pass as a typical able person. But I wondered if we create an environment that sends the message that these things should be hidden and we should pass as much as possible as an able-bodied person. So can anybody comment on that?
I'll take it. Look, I broke my neck. I was an able-bodied young man in Puerto Rico body surfing, and it took me 5 years to fit into my new identity. It takes time to cope when you're not born with it. So it wasn't natural to me. And IBM basically saved my life because I worked for them. They flew me home from Puerto Rico where I had my accident, and I had a 39-year career and ended up as a senior executive at the bank, at the IBM corporation. But it's a challenge even today in terms of how you perceive yourself, and you can't let anybody perceive you the way they want to perceive you. I'm married. I married an able-bodied woman after my accident. She got a lot of flack saying, "Oh, we're sorry about your husband when he got hurt. You must be," and she goes, "No, I married him like that." We have 2 children together. One's 30 and one's 36, and I've got 2 granddaughters. And so we as disability constituents, we can't blame someone else for what happened to us, even if something did happen to us that wasn't our fault. At some point, we've got to find a way to get through this and figure out how to cope the best we can. And I know it's hard, and I still cope with it. I have aides coming in to get me up at night and put me to bed in the morning, put me to bed at night, get me up in the morning, because I don't want my wife to do that. But I've worked hard for this, and I don't think that you go into this stage with waiting for people to help you. You've got to show people what you can do for them, even though you have a disability. And that's been how I've worked.
Steve, did you have a comment? Oh, thank you. All right, so thank you. Time is up. We're going to have to close. So I want to take a moment to thank all of the panelists, Jim, Steve, Iden, Cameron, and Zarifa for being here today and sharing your advice and experiences with us. I want to also give special recognition to Iden for providing invaluable guidance on this topic of race and disability. So today's discussion is a reminder that we have a lot of work to do to ensure that the workplace is equitable and inclusive for everyone. So for those of you who are in our audience today, I want to thank you for joining us this morning. These conversations are only the beginning, and I hope you'll take what you've learned today and apply it in your workplace. We also like to hear feedback from you, so please take our short survey that will appear after you leave this webinar. It's also posted in the chat box. And finally, you should be receiving your election ballots in the mail, so don't forget to vote. Again, thank you, panel. It's a great conversation. I learned a lot, and I really appreciate you being here today. So everybody have a safe day today, and see you at our next Breakfast for Champions. Thank you.